And away we go.
And just like that.
It's like we do this every week or something.
Something like that.
Well, some of us do this. Some of us forget to upload the calendar and get it right, so one of us has to do the show by himself. That's what I've learned today.
That's right.
I'm really bad at keeping up with things. Gosh, I'm still sorry about that. And then I ghosted you while you were trying to figure out what was going on. I'm busy. I'm working out. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I have free time. Sorry.
Oh, well, it's good to be back here because Friday of this past week, April 11th, I had to go visit seemingly an old colleague of yours, Preston Bavona.
The dentist.
The dentist. Thursday evening. I was eating dinner, as a normal person typically does in the evening time. And I felt something. And I was like, that doesn't feel right. And one of my molars was just like, we're just not going to work anymore.
Goodbye.
So I went and paid him a visit. And he did tell me, he's like, as far as dental emergencies go, this isn't a bad one. He said, your tooth is healthy. It just kind of fell apart on you. So it took me 30 years, but I got my first dental filling. Shout out to the good doctor over there. Shout out to him because, I can eat again normally, thank God. But this is much better than any dental surgery that you have to have. So, as far as, as far as not putting stuff on the Google Calendar, that's on the low rung of issues that I've had over the past couple of days. I think we're all right.
I'm glad to hear that because, talking to me has been compared to getting a root canal before. So this is good. Well, it's not just the two of us tonight. We have a special guest, the author and administrator of the Reconstruction era blog online. I got a chance to sit down and really listen to Patrick Young speak at last year's Emerging Civil War Symposium. And I don't know, I guess, other words to say other than I thought it was just really magnificent. And I'm not trying to butter him up because he's waiting out on the side of the stage here. I think going to a Civil War conference and not talking about battles and leaders, but talking about political reconstruction and the post-war kind of dilemmas that we face as a nation, that first is bold, right? But second, it's really, really, really needed because, Bo, we've talked about this before. Somebody goes, "Oh, I'm really into the Civil War." I'm like, "Oh yeah, what do you find most interesting?" "Oh, well, I know that the Springfield rifle, it weighs like 9 pounds." Like, okay, all right. I know what size shoe Robert E. Lee wore. Okay, yeah. Can you tell me anything else? And there's nothing else there, right? And people don't even have the beginning of understanding of Reconstruction, and they get it. It's hard to understand, but to help us clarify some of the points we're going to talk about tonight, specifically Black codes and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, who better to talk about it than Patrick Young? So get Patrick on here, and we'll roll. There he is.
Welcome, Pat.
Hey, coming to you from Long Island, New York.
Hey,
It's a long ways away for us.
it is. Now we just need the Long Island iced tea.
So Patrick, how did you, before we jump into this, how did you find your kind of niche in Reconstruction history?
Well, like a lot of people of my age, I was very drawn to the Civil War as a youth. Most people my age say they got really involved during the 100th anniversary, the centennial of the Civil War.
Mhm.
Of course, I look back and most of them would have been 4 years old at that time. So I think what happened is that it generated a lot of interest in the Civil War history. And a lot of people started reading about it as children. And that's what I did. And then really didn't look into it much after I turned about 30 years old. I'm a lawyer. I teach immigration law at Hofstra Law School on Long Island. I'm also, for many years, I am also a registered lobbyist in New York State, and I have represented thousands of immigrants. So that took up most of my time. But then in 2010, with the anniversary, the sesquicentennial of the Civil War coming up, I started to do some research into immigration history during the Civil War, and I thought I would do maybe 4 articles for a local news source that reached out to immigrants about their history, etc. And instead, I wrote 250 articles on this, and I had over 250,000 unique views by unique individuals over those years. So it became quite large. Of course, by the end of the centennial, I was trying to turn this into immigrants during Reconstruction, and I wrote a number of articles that were fairly popular. But I also began to look at it and saying, really, immigrants are something you want to put on the side. This really is about Black citizens who were not recognized as citizens before 1865. And that really needs to be a group that I wanted to focus on. Now, I spent many years investigating human rights in Central America, in Peru, and in Africa. And so I tried to use some of that experience to look at what went on in human rights in America in the 1860s and 1870s. And, as I began to read more and more, did research into newspapers, read diaries, etc., I became very involved in it. I think I've only been doing this for 10 years, which is probably more than about 95% of Americans have looked into the Reconstruction era. In fact, in 2013, when I started doing this, I had only read 6 books on Reconstruction, which I'm told is more than most people have. But since then, I've read about 250 books on Reconstruction, and still reading almost every day.
That's a good habit to get into, and I think, Patrick, you bring a very unique experience to this broader scope of history here, because Reconstruction is incredibly important, and it's something that is clearly misunderstood by many Americans. I mean, even some young historians, sort of misinterpret things, as it pertains to this post-war era of Reconstruction. So, that's kind of what we're here to do, is to kind of clear up some of those things. Now, granted, Reconstruction happens, over the course of several years, and so obviously we're not going to be able to knock down everything and solve every problem in a, hour-long podcast episode, So, Patrick, one thing that we do kind of want to talk about too, because especially in the post-war era, we see the rise of, and how you've described the Klan as America's oldest terrorist organization. How exactly, do you, look into the Klan, and how does that affect Reconstruction going forward?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are a number of ways. One is there are several modern treatments of the Klan. Just in the last year, we've had Fergus Brodowich write about the Klan War, which is the Ulysses S. Grant essentially making war on the Klan in South Carolina in 1871 and 1872. Elaine Parsons did a book, Ku Klux, because at the time, although it was called the Ku Klux Klan, they typically referred to themselves as Kluxers or Ku Klux. And that's an overall history of the Klan, but also it focuses on the types of media messages that the Klan was trying to send out. Right now we have social media, et cetera, and the Klan was using social media of the 1860s. They did not have tons of money. So if they're dressing up in gowns, if they're riding at night, if they have secret oaths and secret words in which to spread their fear, they're really creating a social media presence in the 1860s. People would often say, oh, we're not sure if they were the Ku Klux. We know that they were Confederate ghosts, because the Ku Klux would say that we're not living men who you could prosecute. We are people who were ghosts who were killed by the Yankees, and we're coming back to revenge ourselves on blacks and on white Republicans who were seen as traitors.
We've just passed the 160th anniversary of Appomattox, and in a few weeks' time, by the time this episode comes out, we'll have passed the anniversary of Johnston's surrender in North Carolina. So this is appropriate time, right, to be wrapping up the war and putting aside all the 160th events and starting the 160th anniversary cycle of Reconstruction, which I understand doesn't have a massive big following, and there's not going to be any 160th anniversary conferences or anything like that, right? But as we kind of jump into the post-war years, right, the war comes to an end. By December of 1865, we'll see the ratification of the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. At the same time, in states like Louisiana and Tennessee, places where Reconstruction had really kind of already been in effect effectively since 1862-63, we start to see a return of a loyalist government. We start to, think about Mississippi, a place rife in secession, rife in the Confederate movement, probably more so post-war than wartime. But what the man who fills Jefferson Davis's seat is a black man in Hiram Revels. We're seeing all these things happening in Reconstruction, and that pretty much brings about an automatic resistance, doesn't it? Because I think I heard you say last year at the Emerging Civil War Conference was that, this progress, you can have progress, but you'll always have resistance, and sometimes it's violent resistance. So what is that? We're kind of alluded to it there with the Kluxers, but what does it lead us to?
Well, it's interesting because General Gordon, who is one of Lee's most trusted generals, told a crowd of mixed race people in Georgia, he said, for blacks, we opposed your freedom because we had bought you. And here in the years after the Civil War ended, people still thought of themselves as having been tremendously deprived by the freedom of black people. In fact, I was looking at one state's recap of its losses, and it was hundreds of millions of dollars. But when you looked at it broken down, almost all of it was people were free. It wasn't that banks had been burned or that produce was stolen, etc. It was the main asset of most white people was their slaves. And so what you have is an almost immediate revulsion against this. So, let's just take a quick look back at how we discover that. When we look at the Reconstruction, everybody always says, well, it starts right after Lee surrendered. But, as you've said with New Orleans, right around the same time that Lee surrendered, it was celebrating the first anniversary of its first black public school. So there were Reconstruction efforts in many, many areas of the South, really beginning in 1862 when Ben Butler welcomes contrabands, which is a term we should never use. These were refugees who were escaping slavery, and he welcomed them into his lines at Fortress Monroe in Virginia. From then on, you do see Lincoln, his generals, abolitionists, particularly women in the North who want to do something more than make war on the Confederates. They want to reconstruct the South so that Blacks can have some type of equal rights and some guiding say in the future of the country. Now, President Johnson sends Grant down south to report on what the condition of the South is, and he actually gives a fairly lukewarm report on it. But he also sends Carl Schurz, who was a German immigrant. He had been a young person who had participated in the 1848 revolution in Germany, had to flee, came to the United States, and became one of the largest political voices in the United States. And he goes down to South Carolina, and then he goes throughout the Gulf states to report on what he's seeing. And what he says is that there is a system of terrorism. This was in July of 1865. So this isn't something that happens much later. This is something that Southern white people were already starting to come to terms with. What he reports is that if you're a Black person and you're trying to organize, you will be shot down. If you're a courier for the army and you're taking orders from one position to another, you'll be shot down. If you're a white Republican, and let's remember that, yes, there were 500,000 to 1 million Southerners in the Confederate Army, but there were 100,000 Southerners who were in the Union Army. Those were white Southerners. There were another 100,000 Blacks in the Union Army. So when we're looking at this, these are very divided communities. It's not as though everybody in these communities was anti-Reconstruction or anti-United States, because Blacks made up a third of the people in the South, and there was a sizable proportion, about 10% of the white population, that was loyal to the United States. But they were immediately attacked. And it's interesting because Schurz talks to Peter Osterhaus, who was another German refugee and was in the United States Army. He was a general. And he said that the state of affairs would essentially put all Union men in danger as soon as the United States withdraws federal troops from the South. And we often think of, well, they're going to withdraw the federal troops in 1877 after Rutherford B. Hayes's election, or maybe non-election, depending on how you view it. But that's not really what happened. You know, what we see in the South is a very, very quick reduction in the military. I don't know if you've heard this in Louisiana, but a lot of people will talk to you about their stories from their great-grandparents about what it was like during Reconstruction. You were stopped on the street by the United States Army. They told you what to do. They put you in jail, et cetera, et cetera. And let's remember that the United States Army had between 1.5 million to 2 million people during the Civil War. Except the problem you have is that by 1866, there's only 61,000 Union troops in the South. You know, people forget about this because they always remember the Grand Review in Washington. And, you know, it's funny, you say, okay, what did they do with those men after they had the Grand Review? Did they go back down south? No, they went home.
Yeah.
You know, and it wasn't just people coming to Washington. There were many states that also organized these types of grand reviews in their capital. In Albany, they did it for New York State troops. And so what you find is you went from having 1.5 million people in the South in June of 1865 down to 61,000. By March of 1866, there's only 41,000 troops remaining. And by September, there was 17,000. Now, when I say these numbers, we're talking about 10 Confederate states. There were more in Texas because they were there primarily to observe Maximilian, the emperor who was put in by France. They were not really doing that much in terms of protecting blacks. But, for the 10 states, you basically had by 1867, only about 2,000 in each state.
Which is not, yeah.
No, go ahead, Bill.
No, I mean, and this is how I explain it to my students, especially when you're talking about the Reconstruction era, is that there's never enough manpower. There's never enough, money that goes to actually reconstructing the South. And I think part of that, Andrew Johnson is sort of to blame there, and Johnson definitely doesn't help, even though Johnson's one of those individuals that can't stand sort of the, top 3% of Southern, slave owners, but he is in, by his very nature, a Southerner, so he does have some Southern sympathies, and so he's definitely not helping the situation at all.
Well,
yeah.
No, I was going to say that he's doing more than not helping. One of the first things he does after the war ends is sell off all the cavalry horses. And so what you'll often find is there may only be 2,000 Union troops in a particular state, and they're all infantry. So you can imagine there are nighttime raids by night riders who were initially not the Klan. They were local organizations, but then by 1868, they're the Klan. They're mounted. They know where everybody is. They know all the secret passages to get away from the army, and the army is chasing them on foot.
Yeah. And the thing I was going to bring in up too is the way you described how there's such a quick downturn and downsize of the army. And then, but people still today will say like, oh, well, I remember doing my great grandpappy told me, I told my grandpappy who told my dad who told me. It sounds a lot like the my great grandpappy, he rode with Forrest, and it's like, at this point, he has like an army of 3 million by the count of who. So it makes me wonder then. When people talk about Reconstruction, they say, well, this happened. And I know because it happened to my family. How many of it is just an instant that's been extrapolated from the historical record? It sounds good, so it becomes the family legend, family lore, and you get stuck with it. But one thing, and Bo and I talked about this in our kind of pre-production, was one of the great myths, and I came across it a lot when I was working in public history. I think it's something that's just become kind of embedded in people's kind of understanding of the post-war Reconstruction era South. Is they'll say things like, well, the Klan didn't start out violent; it only got violent. It was a social club, So how does that, right? A social club for beating and abusing and harassing a free black population, right? That's their main activity, guys. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we take a look at the history of the Klan, the later Klan actually said it was started in Pulaski, Tennessee, which is true, on Christmas Day, 1865. I'm like, didn't they have kids? How could they get together for a meeting on Christmas Day? But actually, it seems like it started in June of 1866. At the very beginning, it did have some mystical notions about it, and people who look at like Grand Cyclops and wizards and so forth. They did that on purpose because they wanted to create a supernatural appearance. As I said earlier, they wanted blacks to think that they were Confederate soldiers who had been resurrected from the dead. Let's also remember who these people were. There's a common view of the Klan that they were ne'er-do-wells, people who really weren't very well educated. But at least in the initial Klan, most of them were professionals. Most of them had the equivalent of a high school degree. Some of them had gone to college. Some were in professions like lawyers. I'm a lawyer, so I have to take some responsibility for that. So they had put this together. Were they initially violent? No. It doesn't mean they weren't planning to be violent, but at least in 1866, there are no reports of them carrying out attacks. They would appear locally, again in costume. Now, they did not appear with the white hoods. They did not appear in white robes. That was created by Dixon, which later, created that view in Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith. But they did wear very, very odd clothing. They could be of all different colors. Red was particularly useful for them because it had that image of blood. And they would go around so that blacks in the neighborhood, Republicans in the neighborhood would know that they existed. But again, they were not killing anyone. They were not beating anyone. It's really in 1867 that the Klan begins to take its wrath out again on blacks and on Republicans. The Republicans were not all from the North. As I say, there were, these were people that Confederate loyalists would call scalawags. They were native to the South, but they wanted to stay part of the United States during the war, and they wanted to make sure that they were reunited with the northern states and not be a separate area. So, they were getting harassed, they were getting attacked. And in 1868, in January, there are reports in national newspapers of the Klan killing people. So, we don't exactly know how many people were killed in 1867, although they were involved in violence. But a year and a half after they were first drawn up, they are engaged in deadly violence against their opponents. By that time, they're not just appearing in Pulaski or in its neighboring communities, because in 1867, they were primarily in those areas. They were beginning to appear all over the South.
So, Patrick, why we talk about how the Klan starts off as this sort of seemingly nonviolent organization, and then we see an uptick as years go on, and everyone typically will point to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but forget about the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which arguably that's for the very first time Congress has to pass this piece of legislation that identifies formerly freed black slaves as citizens. So do we see an uptick in violence after we see the National Congress pass something like this?
I would just say that the violence had already been upticking.
Mm-hmm.
The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was passed in reaction to widespread violence against, particularly against black people. If we look, we have the Memphis riot in the spring of 1866. Over the summer of 1866, you see the New Orleans riot, which is now called the New Orleans Massacre. The Memphis riot, 40 people were killed, all but one of them were black. In the New Orleans riot, a mob descends on black marchers and kills, and again, it's very difficult to figure out how many people were killed, but between 50 and 200 people. So, up until that time in 1866, a lot of Northern Republicans were not radicals. Many of them had come on board because they wanted the Union reunited, and they felt that Southerners, after their armies were defeated, would, for their own good, want to be reintegrated into the Union. And most of them were not thinking of blacks becoming voters. Now, Lincoln had already said that, or I shouldn't say he said, but his Attorney General Bates had said that blacks were citizens of the United States, even without the 14th Amendment or the 1866 Civil Rights Act. So at least within the Republican Party, they did believe that blacks were citizens, but they wanted to do something that would set down that blacks were citizens so that the United States could protect them. Because if they're not U.S. citizens, what's the United States federal government doing protecting them from the legitimate authority of states?
Mm-hmm. And that brings on to another question I have is, you kind of mentioned that at first it's not like a national thing, right? It's not a regional thing. It's very much local, state by state. So we see,
Right.
if Tennessee is the first in December or June of 1866 with the Klan, we see Louisiana too has its own with the White Leaguers and the Knights, and
The
we see
Knights of the
Wade
White
Hampton
Camellia.
Yeah.
and Wade Hampton and his red shirts in South Carolina, and like there's these little movements, and all of them, I'm going back to my roots with Tennessee. All of them are spurred on by a little instance, right? One thing that leads to this kind of outbreak, and in Tennessee, it's Parson Brownlow, right? It's the Reconstruction governor of the state, who had replaced Andrew Johnson, and really he's kind of the spark, and everything else kind of follows right after that. But I'm thinking back to time spent in Franklin, and there's a riot that takes place there in the summer of 1866 or 67, and it's only, I think it's 66, yeah, and there's only a month or two goes by, and Franklin has its own Den of the Klan that just pops up in reaction to what had just happened.
Yeah, I doubt that it was in reaction. I think they looked at that as a marketing opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
The Klan by 1867, 1868 had become more sophisticated in reaching out to areas where they saw trouble brewing.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, as we said with Carl Schurz, which was in 1865, if blacks were moving from where they lived to another place, the white people in the place they were leaving would then attack them so that they wouldn't move. They wanted the blacks to stay there and to be essentially workers for them. What you would see in those situations is the Klan would come in and say, we will work with you white people to maintain solidarity and rule by white people. In fact, they put out their constitution in Mississippi, which said, we must be governed by only white people. And they wanted to make that pretty clear, because if people might be attacking local black people who are trying to assert their rights by moving, you want them to have an ideology that would be part of a much broader national ideology. And as we could see, when the Klan is revived in the 20th century, they're able to actually use that ideology to win many recruits in northern states. Indiana had the fastest growth of the Klan in the 1920s. I live on Long Island. 1 in 7 white Protestant men on Long Island joined the Klan. Now, there were no real Klan claverns outside of the South during Reconstruction. There were some Klan activities outside of the South, but they didn't have a very large number. But by the 1920s, many of the Klan, and again, this is a reconstructed Klan, were in the North because the ideology worked.
Yeah. And that's, I do like that you brought up, especially in the post-war era, that, a lot of, because there is a sort of misconception there that every Republican is a radical Republican, and their radicalism has nothing to do with hanging tin in Hawaii. It's just simply the notion of giving African Americans, basic rights of citizenship. So I guess, Patrick, in your opinion, how exactly does the Klan affect the South's Reconstruction? And kind of going on to that, are we still living in the shadow of Southern Reconstruction, or its failure?
Well, when we talk about Reconstruction and basically what happened with the Klan and its successor organizations, because by 1877, the Klan is almost dead as an organization, although many of its members go on to these groups like the White League or to the red shirts, which was in South Carolina and North Carolina. But let's take a quick look here. We look at Alabama. There were Republicans in control of the state from 1868 until 1872. Not 1872, but 1874. After they're deposed in 1874, the Democrats, which by the 1870s had become allied with the Klan and with these different white organizations, held the governorship until 1983. Jeez. So they basically had a reach that wasn't just for Reconstruction or Jim Crow, but reached much, much further than that. We could look at Arkansas. The Republicans held it from 1868 to 1874. The next Republican who was elected after they were deposed in 1874 was Mike Huckabee in 1996. So and I could go through all 10 states, but particularly for my age, we used to call it the Solid South. They weren't solid just because people loved the Democratic Party. It was that those whose interests might be served by the Republicans in 1910, 1920 were very, very much suppressed. They were primarily Black citizens.
And what I think we'll do here in just a second is we'll do a quick break for commercials, right? And then we'll jump back in, and we kind of want to talk a little bit about the Black codes as well.
Sure.
So we'll be right back with some more homebrew history in just a second. Now you have to look at me for just a moment. Homebrew History is brought to you by Civil War Trails. Civil War Trails is the world's largest outdoor museum. Get out there, make some history of your own. If you want to help Civil War Trails, head over to their website, civilwartrails.org. You can find the link down below in the show notes or the description of this episode. And there you can order yourself a paper map to take with you on your next road trip. Get out there, snap yourself a signed selfie, use the hashtag signed selfie, and tag Civil War Trails to keep spreading the word about our friends in the world's largest outdoor museum. Want to support Homebrew History? Head on over to our Buy Me a Coffee page, and there you can become a member of the Homebrew crew for just $5 whole a month. $5 a month has never made or broken me, and it's never broken Bo either. So head on over to Buy Me a Coffee and become a member today for exclusive live streams, including one just like we did a couple weeks ago with Norma Graham on First Canadian Para. We've got more episodes like that coming down the pipe, so be sure to join us then. Check out our designs by the bearded historian Jeff Williams. You can head over to his Etsy page down below. You'll find a link in the show notes in the description as well. As always, like and subscribe to Homebrew History. Help us continue to fill those coffers so that we can keep doing this and having fun. If you want to have your questions aired on the show, be sure to, like I said, become a member of the Buy Me a Coffee page. It's the only way that you can get questions in to our wonderful guests like Patrick, who you are hearing from right now. And finally, Homebrew History now airs weekly. You can catch us every Monday, and we'll have a new episode out every week. Sometimes we'll do a series twice a week, but be sure to stay up to date and turn those downloads on. I think what we'll do now is we'll head into a commercial break that I don't do, so you don't have to look at me. I don't have to look at you, and you don't have to hear me.
Pretty good.
Now I made it less awkward.
Yeah.
Right? You're not just standing there while I talk.
Yeah, we're just like, okay.
All right. Well, any old time you want to come back now. Any day.
So, Patrick, before we left off with Joey's wonderful face and all those commercials there, we kind of wanted to get back on the show and kind of talk about the Black Codes. So can you kind of tell our listeners what exactly are the Black Codes?
Yeah, when I talk about Reconstruction, a lot of people will say, well, white people in the South were very much oppressed by governments that were put in by Black votes. And, and I actually believed that when I was a kid, because I had heard that too, up here in New York in the 1960s and 1970s. You probably got a similar view that somebody would have gotten in the South. Maybe a different view on the Civil War, but Reconstruction was pretty much the same. That Southern whites were oppressed by the blacks, and that black people had misruled their states, and that's why the black codes were passed. The problem is, when I looked into it, most of the black codes were passed in 1865. So after the Civil War, most of the people who were able to vote, actually all of the people who were able to vote in the 11 southern states, were white. And the only people who could hold office were white, because Andrew Johnson did not follow through by allowing blacks to be recognized as citizens and to vote, which meant that these new legislatures, which had been elected by the white people, many of whom were Confederates, would put in laws that you would think would deal with what? Starving refugees, or disabled veterans, or rebuilding railroads, etc. But that's not what they did. The first thing they did was put in the black codes. And in fact, you will find by fall of 1865, almost every legislature is at least considering a black code. And it's interesting because for the first time really in Southern history, blacks got together and tried to oppose these black codes. And, if we look at it in Charleston, there was a meeting of state delegations from different AME churches, and they said, we do not understand why we are being punished since we haven't done anything. We don't understand. Now, if you look at these codes, we can take a look at Mississippi. Under Mississippi's code, you couldn't vote. Okay, we all knew that. You couldn't hold property. If you were found to be wandering in a neighborhood, in other words, you were going to another town to get a job or to find your relatives, because many people had been separated from their children or from their parents, you would be arrested. Okay? If you were arrested, very often for similar charges, a white person would be fined, whereas a black person would be whipped. They didn't do whippings on white people. The other thing is they would also attach a fine to you. So you get whipped, and then you have to pay $200 or $300, which would be $3,000 to $6,000. If you couldn't pay that, you would be sold on the courthouse steps. Now, they weren't selling you for life, but they would sell you to farmers and industrialists, and you would have to work for them until you had paid your debt. And of course, who's making those figures? Those are white people who are making those figures. And so what we see with these laws, we're seeing both an attempt to control black people, an attempt to get revenge. And it's interesting because a lot of Southern whites did not say because they had fought for the Union, but just because they had been happy that they had been freed, we need to take revenge on them. And the other thing is they want to make sure that black people don't get the notion that they are going to be citizens and that the government owes anything to them, which, as I had said, when we're looking at the South Carolina church people, they did say we're citizens.
That becomes one of the I think the most fascinating pieces, maybe the most unsettling pieces of Reconstruction. And Bo, feel free to chime in. But is when you're talking to a group about what happens to at a historic site where slavery existed. You're talking about the enslaved population, and then you say along comes 1865, and there's this belief in freedom, and you can use the great W.E.B. Du Bois quote, which is for a moment the slaves stood free in the sun and then turned back to slavery. It's slavery by other means. We can use all those different expressions, but inevitably you get somebody that'll say like, well, at least they were free. They had a roof over their head. And I was like, at least they were free, yes, but that doesn't mean that the treatment or that the oppression by systematic oppression was any less of a travesty than it was under the previous regime. I don't know, Bo, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, and that's something very difficult for historical sites, all across the U.S. South that did experience, slavery, prior to, the outbreak of the American Civil War, and because there is a fundamental misunderstanding of Reconstruction, sometimes guests, this is the first time that they hear this information. And as we've already learned, it's something I stress to my students that I teach. I said, look, anytime the status quo is shaken, there's going to be pushback of some kind. And again, sometimes it can be violent. So some people even, just in a basic conversation, explaining that even in the, Reconstruction era, Black people earned their freedom, but that doesn't mean that all of a sudden, the South is, happy go lucky that they're free and treat them as equals. It's going to take, another 100 years, of fighting for civil rights, for fighting for the basics of citizenship to have the security to vote in the first place. So you're absolutely right, Joey, is that this is, a complex, complicated subject that sometimes people just don't they don't have the experience.
Now, Patrick and Bo, I'm going to put a question up in the bar here, and I just want to get your reaction to it.
Okay.
And I'm sorry.
Well, Joey and I,
as we're sitting here talking, I just I have to ask.
The thing is that Joey and I both have worked, in academia and in public history, and sometimes people of the public, because of their lack of understanding, are willing to ask these very outlandish questions. So I'm kind of curious here.
So the question for listeners, right? Does our shortcoming in understanding Reconstruction come from a misunderstanding of slavery and, above all, race? Throw that one to the panel.
That's a great question. I mean, clearly there's a misunderstanding somewhere. But I also think too, some of this stuff, and like Patrick kind of mentioned, when at a very young age, we were sort of willing to accept, sort of these fabricated, facts about Reconstruction, about the American Civil War. Because I mean, when I was a wee young lad, I may have believed, in this idea that the South was just fighting for states' rights, that it didn't have anything to do, with African chattel slavery at all, and I thank God, I've become a learned man since then and have rectified, some of these issues.
Is it that, or your woke milk toast liberal?
I've been called a lot of names, and you know what? I've come to realize that I'm whatever you think I am. I suppose. I don't know.
Patrick, I'm curious what you think.
Well, I think people don't understand slavery at all. First, I'm here in New York, and I'm sorry, we have a call coming in. I'm here in New York, and right next to where I am, I'm living on Long Island, but in Brooklyn, they had the same percentage of slaves in Brooklyn as Virginia.
Wow.
So in other words, it was not a few people who had moved here from the South who held personal slaves. These were people who were farming fields. They were doing very similar work to what was being done in Virginia. And yet we look at Brooklyn at that time as being in a revolutionary state, not in a slave state. Mm-hmm. In 1820, of course, New York does abolish slavery, although it takes some time before the last people are free. So I think that one of the things that we don't understand is that slavery, I won't say it was universal, but it existed in most parts of the United States. And so when we look at our ideology around slavery and ideology around race, we're not just looking at something that was imported from the South, that many parts of the North had also developed this ideology because they also had excuses for why they maintained themselves on the labor of Black people. So I think that's important. The other thing, of course, that most people will say, I think that probably when I was young, a lot of people would say, well, slavery wasn't all that bad. And I don't think you'll meet anybody under 40 who says that. They would see it as very bad. But, for those of us who are old, I'm about to be 70. But what I would say is where, a lot of us have a little bit of, well, they had a job to go to, they got fed, etc. Their children were sold off.
Right.
So that it's a weird thing that, we would kill someone who took our children and sold them off, or taking my parents and selling them off. And yet we expect people who are Black to just accept that in the 1850s and 1860s.
I'm convinced that a lot of that, though, comes from it's a problem with memory, and it's a problem with understanding. I'm convinced that has its roots in the kind of Southern romantic vision of slavery, where it's the benevolent slave, or the benevolent master, and the faithful slave. And it's the only reason there were ever bad slaves was it was a bad master, and so all slaves must have been good, so slavery must have been good. It's easy to run down that rabbit hole. Now, Bo, I know we've done what we always do on this show, which is where we start talking about something that's really, really incredible, and we could spend all night doing it. But inevitably, we have to wrap the episode up. So I want to throw it to Patrick for last few brief words, and then let's jump into Boohickey.
Yeah,
sounds good. All right, Patrick. Anything else you want to add? Something that
I just want to I'm sorry. I do just want to say a little bit about how we remember Reconstruction. There was always after 1877 a rewriting of the history of Reconstruction in the South, but really it got its main propulsion forward to being a general understanding in the early 1900s, when William Dunning, who was from New Jersey and taught at Columbia Law School, began to devote himself to defending Southern whites' treatment of Blacks. Now, it's interesting because he trained a whole group of historians, almost all of whom were from the South, but he himself was from New Jersey. He was one of the primary influences for the writing of The Klansman, which then became Birth of a Nation. And that really led to the reconstruction of the Klan in the 1920s. It became very, very popular. By 1930, Margaret Mitchell, in her book Gone with the Wind, is defending the Klan, although Scarlett O'Hara said the people who were in the Klan were idiots. But, there was a reconstruction of Klan images, both in the North and in the South. And I think that's something we have to keep in mind, that if you went to college, if you studied history, this stuff is bullshit. But if you didn't, a lot of people may understand that there was some gentleness between master and slave that was interrupted by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it doesn't help when you also have, President Woodrow Wilson airing, Birth of a Nation at the White House. And he's famously quoted in saying, it's like writing history with lightning. And I'm
do we call him friend of the show, Woodrow Wilson, friend of the show, or not?
Yeah. You know what? When I die and inevitably go to hell, I'm going to find Woodrow Wilson and set him up with an 8-round boxing match. He's first, and the second person is the inventor of coleslaw. Keep your wet mayonnaise cabbage away from me.
Hitler, Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah, right.
Coleslaw. Yeah.
Cabbage.
All right. Strange lineup, but whatever. I'll take it.
That's right.
Bo,
wait, I'll add one more thing.
Please.
My favorite beer is Beamish.
Okay. All right. Not a bad thing. So, Patrick, what Boohickey history is something that you kind of preluded to. Is that any historian who can see a historical fact and call out the bullshit where it is? It's effectively my substitute for the word. What exactly about Reconstruction or the Black Codes that people either just get wrong completely, something that is misinterpreted, something that you want to dispel a myth about Reconstruction now?
Well, I think that for many Americans, they look at the impact of Reconstruction on white Southerners. And I think that the main thing to do, because Reconstruction was not like the Marshall Plan, where we're restoring industrialization to Europe after the Nazi Holocaust. This was really a reconstruction so that we had a multiracial society, which was not agreed to by, at least by Southern whites and by many people in the North. But I think what's interesting is that if you don't look at it simply from the lens of the white folks, but look at it from the lens of the Black folks who had been suffering under slavery for 300 years, now were free, and what their hopes were and what they used their time to be able to do. They developed the Black churches, they developed Black schools. Most of the school teachers teaching Blacks in the South were not white people coming from the North. They were native-born Black Southerners, okay? And we need to look at that, and we need to look at their political organizations, their social organizations, to see what they were capable of. And while they lost the political battle, many of those institutions survived for 100 years and actually recreated the first civil rights movement in the second civil rights movement of the 1950s.
Incredible stuff. And it's always hard to do the little shift,
Yeah,
right? From a good boohickey like that to what's in your cup.
yeah.
Right. Now I'm gonna be polite, and I'm gonna go straight to Patrick and ask what's in your cup. So this is a segment we've had on the show since its inception, is where we talk about what we're drinking, right? Because we've all sat around, we've had ourselves a nice little pour. You already mentioned your favorite beer is Beamish, so let's go. What's in your cup?
Yeah, Beamish. I wish I was drinking it right now. When I was over in Ireland, I loved that. I would say it's nothing important. I'm having a mixed berry seltzer from Wegmans. I don't know if you even know what Wegmans is. It's
We don't
a
have
gigantic
Wegmans down here.
supermarket up in Rochester and Buffalo, but it's starting to spread all over the country.
Oh, yeah. One of these days. Bo, how about yourself?
Yeah, I have some Tennessee whiskey cider. I have been on that. I'm glad that I don't have one of those addictive personalities, because I would, first of all, not be on this show. I would just be a drunk somewhere, living in a box under the bridge somewhere, or in a van down by the river, as the late great Mr. Farley put it. But no, it's good stuff. This Tennessee whiskey cider is absolutely delightful. Joey, how about yourself? And you said I was going to hate you, so what you got?
What's new? All right. I'm drinking a lemon ginseng and ginger green tea.
Are you sure you're not about to be 70?
It's the show is called Home Brew. It doesn't say necessarily that it has to be an intoxicating liquor. Okay,
That's a good point. I guess that's why I'm here, I suppose.
The show is intentionally vague. All are welcome.
That's
in
right.
This place.
That's right.
To quote the gathering hymnals song at your local Catholic church, all are welcome here. Oh man. Well, Patrick, I gotta be honest, I've so enjoyed this discussion and really, really just had a good time. People, of course, our listeners and viewers, they can find more from you on, you've got Reconstruction Era, the blog. You've also got a Facebook presence, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we'll put links to both of those.
You just look under Patrick Young and I'll accept you.
Joey,
you're welcome.
That's true. Joey actually sent me a link to your blog, and I had the opportunity this afternoon to kind of read over a couple of articles that you wrote. They're absolutely fantastic. So anybody that wants to know more about Patrick, that's where you can find him, and of course on Facebook. But Patrick, this was a topic of discussion that we can expand on for hours, but we want to thank you, first of all, for coming on the show and helping us out with a little bit of reconstructing Reconstruction history.
Thank you.
And until next time, everybody, cheers.
Cheers, everybody.